The phone buzzed on the cluttered nightstand, its harsh vibrations slicing through the stillness of my darkened apartment like a saw cutting through wood. It was well past midnight, the city outside shrouded in a thick blanket of late March fog, and I groaned, rolling over in bed to squint at the screen. The name Tristan stared back at me, stark and unrelenting, a ghost from a past I'd spent years trying to bury. My brother, my betrayer. My heart thudded hard against my ribs, a surge of adrenaline coursing through me as I fumbled to pick it up, my fingers clumsy with sleep and disbelief. I hadn't spoken to him in over a decade, not since he'd shattered my life by sleeping with my wife Elaine and leaving her pregnant with his child. He'd vanished after that, leaving me to wade through the wreckage alone, only to resurface later with $2 million inheritance dumped in my lap after our parents disowned him. Now here he was, calling me in the dead of night like nothing had happened. I pressed the phone to my ear, my breath shallow, and his voice rasped through the line, rough, frantic, laced with desperation. "I need your help," he said, the words spilling out in a rush. "I'm in deep trouble, man. Real bad shit. Please, you're the only one I've got left." I didn't respond right away. Couldn't find my voice. The sheer audacity of it, the nerve to reach out after everything, heat left me reeling as my mind spun back to the beginning of this nightmare that refused to let me go. 12 years ago, life was different. Elaine and I were married, settled into a small house on a quiet street lined with sycamore trees just beyond the city limits. We'd been together 8 years, 6 as husband and wife, and I thought we were happy. She'd greet me after work with a tired smile, her golden hair tied back loosely from a long day managing a small bookstore downtown, and we'd spend evenings cooking together, or curled up on the couch with a movie. We'd talk about the future, maybe a kid someday, a little girl with her bright eyes, or a boy with my quiet stubbornness. Money was tight, and we argued sometimes over bills or whose turn it was to mow the lawn. But it was a good life, one we'd built together. Tristan was woven into that fabric too. My older brother by 3 years, the wild one who'd always been larger than life. He'd roll into town with a backpack and that charming grin, crashing on our couch for days or weeks at a time. He'd fill the room with stories of bar fights, shady deals, near misses, and I'd laugh, glad to have him around. He was the guy who'd taught me how to fish by the creek, who'd stood up for me when I was a scrawny kid getting shoved around at school. I trusted him completely, loved him like only a little brother could. That blind faith was my first mistake. The signs crept in so slowly I didn't see them at first. Elaine started pulling away, her warmth fading into something distant. She'd check her phone late at night, her fingers tapping out quick replies before flipping it face down on the nightstand. I'd ask who she was texting, keeping it light, and she'd brush it off. "Just a friend from work," she'd say, her voice too casual. I let it slide. Tristan was around more than usual, dropping by with a six-pack or dragging us out to some dive bar on the edge of town. I'd catch them sharing looks, laughing at private jokes I didn't get, but I told myself it was nothing. They got along. Great, right? Better than a wife who hated her brother-in-law. But the unease grew, a quiet itch I couldn't scratch, a shadow I couldn't name. Then one stormy Thursday, I came home early from a work trip. I'd texted Elaine I'd be late, but a canceled flight brought me back ahead of schedule. I walked in, rain-soaked and carrying a bag of her favorite Thai takeout, expecting a warm welcome. Instead, I found them on the couch, her legs tucked under her, his arms slung across the backrest, their shoulders brushing in a way that screamed intimacy. It wasn't sex, not yet, but it was wrong, a violation that hit me like a freight train. "What the fuck is this?" I demanded, my voice cutting through the air. They jumped apart, guilt flashing in their eyes, but neither spoke. The takeout slipped from my hands, spilling across the floor, and I stood there waiting for an explanation that never came. That night, Elaine confessed everything. We sat at the kitchen table, the storm raging outside, and she told me the truth. "It's been going on for 9 months, she said, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. 9 months of lies, of them sneaking around while I worked late to keep our life afloat. My wife and my brother, carving out a hidden life behind my back, laughing at me while I played the fool." I felt the ground drop out from under me, my chest tightening as she kept talking. "I'm pregnant," she said finally, her hands twisting in her lap. "It's his." The words were a sledgehammer, smashing through every hope I'd ever had. Pregnant. With Tristan's kid, not mine. We dreamed of a family, spent nights planning it, names, nursery colors, all of it, and now that dream was ash, replaced by this nightmare. "How could you do this to me?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the thunder outside. She didn't answer, just sobbed harder, mumbling apologies that meant nothing. "Get out," I said, cold and final. She begged me to listen, to let her explain, but I couldn't hear it. I watched her pack a suitcase, her cries echoing through the house, and when she drove away into the rain, I sank to the floor, the silence swallowing me whole. Tristan didn't have the guts to face me. I called him that night, screaming into the phone until my throat burned, demanding he tell me why. "I'm sorry, man," he muttered, then hung up. That was it, the last I heard from him for years. He vanished, leaving me alone in the wreckage. The divorce was swift and brutal. Elaine didn't fight me. She signed the papers and faded away, taking her guilt and his baby with her. I sold the house a month later. Every inch of it was poisoned. Her laughter in the kitchen, our nights in the bedroom, the garden she'd tended while plotting with him. I couldn't stay, couldn't breathe in a space so full of ghosts. I moved into a cheap apartment downtown, a gray box with peeling paint and a view of a brick wall. It wasn't home, just a place to survive, and that's all I could manage. Friends rallied at first, bringing food or dragging me out, but their support waned as the months dragged on. "You'll move on," they said. "But how do you move on when your wife and your brother rip your world apart in one cruel stroke?" The years that followed were a slow grind. I threw myself into work, piling on hours at the accounting firm, burying the pain under spreadsheets and late-night coffee. The days blurred together, but the nights were hell. Alone with my thoughts, replaying every moment, wondering what I'd missed. My parents took it hard too. They'd loved Tristan, their firstborn, always cleaning up his messes with a sigh and a check. When I told them what he'd done, my mom broke down, sobbing into her hands, and my dad just sat there, his face carved with betrayal. They cut him off completely. No calls, no letters, nothing. I heard he'd moved west, chasing some shady deal, living fast while I limped along. I didn't care to know more. He was gone, and I wanted him to stay that way. The hurt didn't fade, it settled into me, a constant ache I learned to live with. I dated a little, nothing serious, just flings to keep the loneliness at bay. Years passed, and I built a fragile routine. Work, sleep, repeat. 8 years after the divorce, a lawyer called. Tristan was dead, he said. A car crash, drunk, speeding, classic Tristan. I didn't cry, didn't feel much, just a dull void where something should have been. But then the lawyer kept talking. Tristan had left me $2 million. Some tech startup he'd stumbled into had hit it big before he spiraled out. My parents got nothing. He'd written them out of the will, a final slap to the family he'd torched. I sat there stunned, the phone still in my hand. $2 million from the man who'd ruined me. It didn't make sense. Was it guilt? A twisted joke? I didn't want it, didn't touch it. The money went into an account locked away like a secret I couldn't face. Friends said I was crazy, buy a car, take a trip, live a little. But every time I thought about spending it, I saw Elaine's tears, Tristan's cowardice, the life they'd stolen. It wasn't a gift, it was a curse, a reminder of every wound he'd left behind. I kept living my small life, the inheritance a shadow I ignored. Work, sleep, repeat. The pain dulled over time, not gone but bearable, a scar instead of a raw wound. I thought that was the end. Tristan dead, Elaine gone, the money a footnote I'd never use. Until that midnight call yanked me back. Tristan's voice shattered the illusion. He wasn't dead. He'd faked it, staged the crash, forged the will, vanished into another lie. Now he was back, alive and desperate. "I owe people money," he said, his voice thick with fear or booze, maybe both. "Dangerous people. They'll kill me if I don't pay up. You've got the cash, I know you do. Help me, please." I almost laughed, the absurdity of it hitting me like a wave. After everything, the affair, the baby, the years of nothing, he thought I'd dip into his tainted millions to save him? The $2 million wasn't even real. He'd scammed it, tangled himself in debt and danger, and now it was catching up. He'd bet on me being the loyal brother, blood outweighing the hell he'd put me through. I let him plead, his words a frantic stream of excuses and promises. He'd fucked up, he said. He'd change, he'd make it right. The same old lies, dusted off for a new day. I thought about hanging up, letting him drown in the mess he'd made. He deserved it, more than deserved it. For Elaine, for the kid I'd never meet, for the decade of agony he dumped on me without a glance back. I pictured him running, terrified, finally facing the consequences, and it felt good, letting that anger burn bright. But then memories slipped in, uninvited. Tristan as a kid, chasing me around the yard with a water gun, teaching me how to throw a punch. The brother who'd stayed up with me during storms, who'd shared his last sandwich when I was hungry. That Tristan was gone, buried under the selfish wreck he'd become, but the echo lingered. I hated that it did. Hated that I couldn't just hate him clean and simple. I didn't want to save him. Every rational part of me screamed to say no, to let him rot. But there was this quiet, stubborn thread, pity, maybe, or just exhaustion. I'd carried the hate so long it was part of me, and I was tired of the weight. Not forgiveness, I'd never get there, but a chance to let go, to stop letting him define me. I'll think about it, I said finally, cutting through his babbling. My voice was flat, cold. He started thanking me, tripping over his words, but I shut him down. Don't call again until I decide. I mean it. I hung up, the silence rushing back like a tide. The phone sat there, a dark lump on the nightstand, as I stumbled to the kitchen and grabbed a beer from the fridge. I stepped onto the tiny balcony, the fog thick outside, and cracked it open, the cold biting my throat as I stared into the haze. The $2 million loomed large, a question I couldn't dodge. Was it mine? Could I use it to pull him out of this hole? I didn't know. Part of me wanted to burn it, send it back to whatever pit he'd crawled from. Another part wondered if helping him might cut the cord, let me walk away free. I sipped the beer, letting my thoughts drift. Elaine was out there, raising his kid, my niece or nephew, I guess. My parents were older now, worn thin by years of grief, still mourning the son they'd lost twice. And me, I was still here, scarred but standing, a survivor of his chaos. What did I owe him? What did I owe myself? The questions spun, endless, as the fog thickened outside. I thought about the past, every laugh we'd shared, every fight, every moment that led to this. I thought about the future. Could I move on, really move on, with him still tied to me? The money was a lifeline or a noose, and I couldn't tell which. Maybe I'd help him, just enough to get him gone again. Maybe I'd walk away, let him face the fire alone. Or maybe I'd do nothing, let fate decide. The beer was empty now, the can crumpled in my fist. I tossed it aside and leaned on the railing, the damp air brushing my face. 12 years of betrayal, pain, and now this. A brother who'd ruined me, begging for salvation. I didn't have an answer, not tonight. But for the first time I felt the burden shift, just a fraction, and that was something. Tomorrow I'd figure it out, or I wouldn't. Either way, I'd made it this far. I could keep going. I turned back inside, the fog swallowing the city behind me, and let the night take what was left.